The studio lights were blazing that Tuesday afternoon, and nobody in that room knew they were about to witness one of the most explosive moments in talk show history. Jon Stewart sat across from Meghan Markle, his signature half-smile playing on his lips as the cameras rolled. It started innocently enough. She was there to promote her latest initiative, something about women's empowerment and media reform. The audience was warm, welcoming, clapping at all the right moments. But anyone paying close attention could feel it, that subtle tension crackling beneath the surface like electricity before a storm. Jon leaned back in his chair, that classic pose of his, pen tapping against his desk. "So, Meghan," he said, his voice carrying that familiar mix of curiosity and challenge, "you've talked a lot about the media being unfair to you. But isn't there something to be said about the choices you've made that put you in that spotlight?" The audience went quiet. You could hear the shift in energy, see it in the way people straightened up in their seats. Meghan's smile didn't falter, but her eyes went cold. "Jon," she said, her voice steady but with an edge sharp enough to cut glass, "I think you, of all people, should understand what it's like to be misrepresented." He nodded slowly, but there was something else brewing now. Sure," he said, waving his hand dismissively, and that gesture, that small wave was like lighting a match near gasoline. "But I never sat down for a 2-hour primetime special to air my grievances while claiming I wanted privacy." The audience gasped. Some laughed nervously. Camera operators glanced at each other, unsure whether to keep rolling or cut away. The producers in the control room were frozen, watching their monitors with wide eyes, knowing they were capturing something unprecedented, something that would break the internet within hours. Meghan's jaw tightened. She set down the water glass she'd been holding, and the sound of it hitting the table echoed in the sudden silence. "That's unfair, and you know it," she said, her voice rising just enough to betray the emotion she was trying to contain. "You have no idea what it's like to have your entire life dissected, to have lies printed about you every single day, to have your mental health ignored, to be called names by people who've never even met you." Her hands were trembling now, just slightly, but the cameras caught it. Everything was being captured in brutal high definition. Jon sat forward, his expression shifting from playful to serious. "You're right, I don't know what that's like," he said, and for a moment it seemed like he might back down, might soften, but then he continued. "But I also didn't marry into one of the most famous families on earth and then act surprised when cameras followed me. I didn't do interviews talking about how hard my life was from a multi-million-dollar mansion." The words hung in the air like smoke. The audience was dead silent now, some covering their mouths, others recording on their phones despite the strict no filming policy. Meghan stood up, just stood right up in the middle of the interview, and you could feel the collective intake of breath from everyone in that studio. Her eyes were glistening, tears threatening to spill but held back by sheer force of will. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "This dismissal, this mockery. You sit here in your comfortable chair with your clever jokes, and you reduce my trauma to a punchline. You make suffering into a debate topic." Jon stood too, and that's when you knew this had gone beyond scripted television, beyond the usual back and forth of celebrity interviews. This was real. "Meghan," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading, "I'm not mocking your trauma. I'm questioning your methods. There's a difference." But she was already shaking her head, already backing away from the desk. "No," she said firmly. "You don't get to decide what my pain looks like or how I process it. You don't get to tell me I'm doing it wrong." The producers were in her ear now. You could see her touching her earpiece, someone desperately trying to de-escalate, trying to bring this back to safe ground. But it was too late. The dam had broken. "You know what, Jon?" Meghan said, pulling out her earpiece and letting it dangle from her collar. "I came here thinking you were different, thinking you understood. But you're just like the rest of them." Her voice cracked on that last word, and a single tear finally escaped, rolling down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away.
Jon's face had gone pale. You could see him processing, calculating, realizing this had spiraled beyond his control. "Meghan, wait, let's take a breath here," he said, moving around the desk, but she was already walking toward the exit. A production assistant tried to gently guide her back, touching her arm, but Meghan pulled away. "Don't," she said sharply. "I'm done here." The audience didn't know whether to applaud or sit in horrified silence. They chose silence. But Jon wasn't letting it end like this. "So that's it?" he called after her, his voice louder now, echoing through the studio. "When things get uncomfortable, you just walk away? You talk about wanting dialogue, but the moment someone challenges you, you're gone?" Meghan stopped. Her back was to him, to the cameras, to the hundreds of eyes watching. Her shoulders rose and fell with deep breaths. For 5 seconds, maybe 10, nobody moved. Then she turned around, and the look on her face was something between devastation and rage. "You want to talk about walking away?" she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Let's talk about how you walked away from your show when things got too hard. Let's talk about how you get to step back, disappear, come back when you feel like it, and everyone calls it self-care. But when I try to protect myself, when I try to set boundaries, I'm difficult. I'm demanding. I'm a problem." The words landed like physical blows. Jon's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The audience was shifting uncomfortably now, some standing, some sitting, none knowing the appropriate response. A senior producer finally stepped onto the set, a woman in her 50s with a headset and a desperate expression. "Okay, everyone, let's take 5, she announced, trying to sound casual, but her voice was strained. Let's take a break." But Meghan was already unhooking her microphone, pulling the battery pack from her waistband. "I don't need 5 minutes, she said. "I need to leave." She handed the equipment to a stunned sound technician and started walking again. Jon ran his hair through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but the microphone caught it. Everything was still recording. The cameras were still rolling because nobody had given the order to stop. "What's ridiculous," she said, whirling back one more time, "is that I have to defend my right to exist, to feel, to speak, over and over again. What's ridiculous is that people like you get to make careers out of criticizing others, and then act shocked when those others have something to say back." The energy in the room was suffocating now. Crew members were looking at their shoes, at the walls, anywhere but at the two figures locked in this battle. "I've dedicated my life to speaking truth," Jon said, his voice tight, "even when it's uncomfortable, even when people don't want to hear it. That's what journalism is. That's what honest conversation looks like." Meghan laughed, but it was hollow, bitter. "Honest conversation? This isn't honest conversation, Jon. This is an ambush. This is you using your platform to score points while I'm expected to sit here and smile and be grateful for the opportunity." She walked past the cameras, past the audience that was now murmuring, some shouting support, some criticism, the whole studio dissolving into chaos. Jon stood there at his desk, hands still in his hair, looking lost in a way that his viewers had never seen him look before. "Cut," someone finally yelled. "Cut the cameras." But it didn't matter. The damage was done. The moment was captured. Within 30 minutes, shaky phone footage would be uploaded to social media. Within an hour, it would be trending worldwide. Backstage, Meghan's team surrounded her immediately. Her publicist was on 3 phones at once, her assistant was trying to get her water, her security detail was clearing a path to the exit. But Meghan just stood there in the hallway, staring at nothing, her chest heaving with suppressed sobs. "I shouldn't have come," she whispered to no one in particular. "I knew this would happen. I knew it." One of her team members, a young woman with kind eyes, touched her shoulder gently. "You stood up for yourself," she said. "That's all you did." But Meghan shook her head. "I lost control. I let him get to me. That's exactly what they wanted."
On the other side of the building, Jon was in his dressing room, tie loosened, head in his hands. His producers were talking over each other, discussing damage control, talking about editing options, debating whether to air the interview at all. "What were you thinking?" one of them demanded. "You don't go after a guest like that." Jon looked up, his eyes red. "I was just asking questions," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. "I was just doing what I always do." Another producer, an older man who'd worked with Jon for years, sat down next to him. "Jon," he said quietly, "there's asking hard questions, and then there's that. That was something else." The silence that followed was deafening. Jon reached for his phone, scrolling through the messages already flooding in, the tweets, the headlines forming in real time. Meghan Markle storms off Jon Stewart show. Royal meltdown on live TV. Stewart versus Markle, the interview that exploded. He put the phone face down on the table, unable to look anymore. "I didn't mean for it to go like that," he said softly. I wanted her to see, to understand." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Meanwhile, Meghan was in her car, city lights blurring past the tinted windows. She was finally letting the tears fall freely now, mascara streaking down her face. Her phone was buzzing non-stop, vibrating against her leg, that she ignored it. Her husband would be calling soon, she knew. He'd be furious, protective, ready to release statements and defend her honor. But right now, in this moment, she just felt exhausted. Exhausted from fighting, from explaining, from having to justify her existence to people who would never understand. Back at the studio, audience members were filing out, clustering in groups, phones out, already posting their first-hand accounts. "I was there. I saw the whole thing." Some defended Meghan, calling Jon cruel and insensitive. Others defended Jon, saying he was just doing his job, asking the questions everyone wanted answered. The debate raged before the episode even aired. The producers made the decision to postpone the broadcast, to review the footage, but everyone knew what that meant. They were deciding how to spin it, how to edit it, how to minimize the fallout. In the days that followed, neither Jon nor Meghan would speak publicly about what happened. Their representatives would release carefully worded statements about differences in perspective and passionate discourse. But privately, both would replay that interview over and over in their minds. Jon would lie awake at night wondering if he'd crossed a line, if his pursuit of truth had become cruelty. He'd remember the look in Meghan's eyes, that moment when something inside her broke, and he'd feel a twist of guilt he couldn't quite shake. Meghan would sit in her garden, staring at the flowers, thinking about all the things she wished she'd said differently. Not softer, not kinder, but clearer, more composed. She'd wonder if walking off made her look weak or strong, if she'd proven his point or made her own. She'd think about the millions of women who'd watch that interview and see themselves in her anger, in her tears, in her refusal to be diminished. And she'd think about the millions who'd call her dramatic, difficult, demanding. The interview would never officially air, but the footage would leak anyway, as these things always do. It would be dissected frame by frame, analyzed by body language experts and media critics. People would take sides, draw battle lines, use the confrontation as evidence for whatever narrative they already believed. Some would say it proved Meghan was unstable, unable to handle criticism. Others would say it proved the media's treatment of her was cruel, that even someone like Jon Stewart, supposedly one of the good ones, couldn't resist taking cheap shots. But what nobody would talk about, what would get lost in all the analysis and hot takes and Twitter wars, was the very human moment at the center of it all. Two people, both hurting in different ways, both convinced they were right, both unable to find common ground. A man who built his career on holding power accountable, suddenly confronted with his own power. A woman who'd spent years being told to be quiet, finally refusing to stay silent. And the collision of those two forces, raw and real and impossible to look away from. Weeks later, a mutual friend would try to broker a private meeting between them. Jon would agree immediately.
Meghan would think about it for days before declining. Maybe someday, she'd tell her team, but not now. The wound is too fresh. Jon would understand, or at least he'd try to. He'd send flowers with a note that simply said, "I'm sorry for my part in your pain." Meghan would read it, set it aside, and not respond. The silence would speak louder than any words could. And in studios across America, producers would add new guidelines to their pre-interview meetings. Boundaries would be discussed. Topics would be pre-approved. The illusion of spontaneous conversation would be carefully scripted to avoid another moment like that one. Because that's what happens when something real breaks through the performance of television. Everyone scrambles to make sure it never happens again. They tighten the controls, they soften the edges, they make everything safe and sanitized and utterly forgettable. But for those who were in that studio that day, for those who watched two people bare their souls in anger and hurt and frustration, for those who saw behind the curtain to the messy, complicated truth of human conflict, the memory would linger. It would remind them that beneath all the polish and production, beneath the carefully crafted public personas, there are just people, flawed and hurting and trying their best, sometimes failing, sometimes lashing out, sometimes walking away because staying would break them. That's what nobody would quite capture in all the coverage that followed. The genuine emotion, the real stakes, the fact that both of them would go home that night and lie awake replaying every word, every gesture, every moment where things might have gone differently. The fact that both of them would carry that confrontation with them, a scar they'd touch occasionally, remembering the day they collided in front of millions and neither one emerged unscathed. That's the part that would stay hidden, locked away in the private thoughts of two people who briefly dropped their masks and showed the world exactly how much words can hurt, how deep wounds can go, and how impossible it is to bridge some divides, no matter how much you might want to try.